Imagine a country that possesses the ultimate weapon of mass destruction. It has a military that ranks among the most powerful in the world. It sits on a piece of land that every major superpower, from the US to China to Russia, desperately wants to control or influence. It has a population of over 240 million people, a massive workforce, and fertile lands that could feed half a continent. By all accounts, this country should be a titan. It should be an Asian tiger. It should be a powerhouse. But instead, it is broke. And I don't mean I can't afford a new iPhone broke. I mean, we might not be able to import fuel next week broke. I mean, inflation hitting 30–40%. I mean, a currency that is melting faster than ice cream in the Sahara. This is the story of Pakistan, the world's only nuclear-armed nation that is also essentially living paycheck to paycheck on the international stage. It is a paradox that baffles economists and frustrates its own citizens. How can you build a nuclear bomb but fail to build a stable power grid? How can you have an army that rivals the best in the world, yet have an education system where millions of children are out of school? Today, we are going to dissect the economy of Pakistan. We are going to look past the headlines of terrorism and cricket to understand the structural rot that has turned a land of immense potential into the sick man of South Asia. We will explore how an obsession with security ate the economy, how the elite captured the state, and why, despite getting billions of dollars in aid over decades, the average Pakistani is poorer than their counterpart in Bangladesh, the very country that Pakistan once looked down upon. This is Ninx, and this video is researched and compiled from various sources. If there are any inaccuracies, or if you have a different perspective, please comment below. Let's dive into the complex, often tragic, but fascinating economic history of Pakistan. To understand why Pakistan is poor today, we have to go back to the beginning. And the beginning was messy. In 1947, the British decided they were done with India. They drew some lines on a map, packed their bags, and left. The result was the partition of British India into two independent dominions, India and Pakistan. Pakistan was born in chaos. It was a geographical oddity consisting of two wings, West Pakistan and East Pakistan, separated by 1,000 miles of hostile Indian territory. Imagine if the U.S. consisted of California and New York, but everything in between was an enemy country. That was Pakistan. From day one, the economy was at a disadvantage. Most of the industrial centers, the major factories, and the established infrastructure remained in India. Pakistan got the agricultural hinterlands. They produced the raw materials like jute and cotton, but the factories to process them were across the border. It was like inheriting a farm, but having to sell your crops to your neighbor who owns the mill, and who also happens to hate you. But here is where the first major fork in the road appears. Instead of focusing purely on building that industrial base, the early leaders of Pakistan became obsessed with one thing: India, specifically the dispute over Kashmir. This isn't a history lesson on Kashmir, but from an economic perspective, this obsession was fatal. It meant that from the very start, the military was given priority over everything else. In a normal country, the army exists to protect the nation so the economy can grow. In Pakistan, it often feels like the economy exists solely to feed the army. This created a power imbalance that plagues the country to this day. The military became the most organized, powerful, and funded institution in the country. And when you have a hammer, everything looks like a nail. Or in this case, when you have a tank, every political problem looks like it needs a coup. This leads us to the concept of the establishment. In Pakistan, people don't usually say the army runs the country out loud. They refer to the establishment. It's the deep state, the military and intelligence apparatus that pulls the strings even when there is a civilian government. Why does this matter for the economy? Because political instability is kryptonite for investment. Since 1947, no prime minister in Pakistan's history has ever completed a full 5-year term. Let that sink in. Not one. They get assassinated, they get dismissed by the president, they get disqualified by the courts, or they get overthrown by the military. If you are a foreign investor, are you going to build a billion-dollar factory in a country where the guy who signed your contract might be in jail next week? Probably not. You're going to take your money to Vietnam, to Bangladesh, or to India. But it's not just about coups. It's about the milbus, military business. The Pakistani military isn't just about guns and borders. They run a massive business empire. They own banks. They make cement. They produce fertilizer. They bake bread. They run housing societies. The Defense Housing Authority, DHA, is one of the biggest real estate developers in the country. Now you might say, so what? The Chinese army used to run businesses too. The problem is that these military businesses often enjoy advantages that the private sector doesn't. They get tax breaks. They get prime land. They get state contracts. It crowds out the private sector. It creates an uneven playing field. It turns the guardians of the state into the owners of the state. Let's talk about the specific economic policies that drove the car off the cliff. For decades, Pakistan relied on a model that was doomed to fail. Import-led consumption. Here is how it works. You overvalue your currency. You make the Pakistani rupee stronger than it should be. Why? Because it makes imported stuff cheap. The middle class in Lahore and Karachi can buy imported cars, imported fuel, imported tea, and imported gadgets cheaply. Everyone feels rich. The politicians get votes because gas is cheap and sugar is cheap. But wait, if you import more than you export, you need dollars to pay for it. Where do those dollars come from? Well, Pakistan doesn't export enough. Their main export is textiles, towels, bed sheets, denim. That makes up about 60% of their exports. But they haven't moved up the value chain. They are still selling low-value stuff, while competitors like Vietnam moved to electronics and high-tech manufacturing. So you have a massive trade deficit. You are buying champagne on a beer budget. To plug that gap, Pakistan relies on 3 things: remittances, aid, and loans. Remittances are the lifeline. Millions of Pakistanis work abroad, in the Middle East, in the UK, in the US. They send billions of dollars home to their families. This cash keeps the economy afloat. It's the only reason the country hasn't collapsed completely years ago. But you can't build a superpower on the backs of taxi drivers and construction workers sending cash home. That's survival, not growth. Then there is aid. During the Cold War, Pakistan was America's buddy against the Soviets. The dollars flowed in. During the War on Terror, Pakistan was a major non-NATO ally. The dollars flowed in. It was a geopolitical rentier state. They rented out their strategic location in exchange for cash. But the problem with renting out your location is that eventually the tenant leaves. The U.S. pulled out of Afghanistan. The Cold War ended. The free money dried up. And that leaves loans. When the dollars run out, Pakistan goes to the IMF, the International Monetary Fund. Pakistan is addicted to the IMF. They have gone to the IMF 23 or 24 times since independence. That is a world record, or close to it. The cycle is always the same. The government spends too much, they import too much, they run out of dollars, they go to the IMF. The IMF says, okay, here is a loan, but you have to raise taxes, cut subsidies, and stop printing money. The government agrees. They get the money. They do a few reforms. But the reforms are painful. The people get angry because electricity prices go up. So, the government stops the reforms halfway through. They start spending again to win the next election. The economy crashes again. They go back to the IMF. Rinse and repeat. It is the definition of insanity, doing the same thing over and over and expecting a different result. Now, let's talk about the elite, the 1% of Pakistan. In many developing countries, the rich are rich, but they also create industries. In Pakistan, the elite capture is absolute. You have the feudal lords. Yes, feudalism is alive and well in Pakistan. Huge landowners who control vast tracts of land and the people who live on them. They dominate parliament. And guess what? They made sure that agriculture, a huge part of the economy, is barely taxed. They grow sugarcane and wheat. They get subsidies from the government, which is basically them giving money to themselves, and they pay almost zero tax on their income. Then you have the industrialists. They are protected by high tariffs. If you want to import a car in Pakistan, the taxes are insane. This is done to protect the local car industry. But the local industry consists of 3 Japanese companies assembling cars from imported kits and selling them at high prices. There is no innovation, no competition. They are lazy monopolies protected by the state. And then, the real estate tycoons. In Pakistan, if you have money, you don't invest in a startup. You don't build a factory. You buy land. You buy a plot in a DHA society. You wait for the price to go up. You sell it. You pay very little tax on that profit. This plotistan economy sucks all the capital out of productive sectors. Why would anyone risk building a factory, dealing with labor unions, corrupt inspectors, and power outages when they can just flip land and make millions tax-free? The result is a country that produces very little of value, but consumes a lot. Let's touch on the energy crisis. This is a classic example of mismanagement. Pakistan has a chronic shortage of electricity. They have load shedding, power cuts that last for hours, sometimes 10 to 12 hours a day in the summer. How can you run a textile factory if the lights go out half the time? You can't. You have to run diesel generators, which is expensive. So your towels become more expensive than Bangladesh's towels, and you lose the customer. The energy sector is trapped in something called circular debt. It's complicated, but basically, the government sets electricity prices lower than the cost of producing it, to keep voters happy. but they don't pay the power companies the difference. So the power companies can't pay the fuel suppliers. So the fuel suppliers stop supplying fuel, and the lights go out. The debt just keeps piling up, reaching trillions of rupees. It is a black hole in the budget. And we cannot ignore the human capital disaster. Pakistan has a youth bulge. The majority of the population is under 30. This could be a demographic dividend, a massive workforce to power the economy. But instead, it is a demographic time bomb. Why? Because the education system is broken. Millions of kids are out of school. Those who are in school often attend ghost schools, schools that exist on paper, where teachers draw salaries, but no building exists, or no classes happen. Or they attend madrasas, religious seminaries that provide food and shelter, but often lack modern curriculum. So you have millions of young men entering the workforce every year with no skills, no jobs, and a lot of frustration. This is fertile ground for extremism. It's not that these kids want to be terrorists. It's that they have no hope, no future, and someone hands them a gun and a purpose. This extremism then scares away investors, destroys tourism, and forces the state to spend even more on security. It is a vicious, self-feeding cycle. Now, let's bring in the China factor. In recent years, Pakistan thought it found a savior: China. The China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, or CPEC. It was billed as a game changer. $62 billion of investment. Roads, power plants, a massive port in Gwadar. The narrative was, America abandoned us, but our iron brother China will save us. And to be fair, China did build power plants. They did build roads. But nothing in this world is free. The loans from China came with strings attached. High interest rates, guaranteed returns for Chinese companies. Much of the machinery and labor was imported from China. So Pakistan got the infrastructure, but they also got a mountain of debt owed to Beijing. And because Pakistan doesn't export enough to earn the dollars to pay back these loans, they are now stuck. They have to borrow more from China just to pay the interest on the old loans. It's a debt trap, or at least a very deep hole. Gwadar Port, which was supposed to become the next Dubai, is still largely a ghost town. The security situation in Baluchistan, where the port is located, is terrible. Separatist groups attack Chinese engineers because they see CPEC as exploitation of their resources without benefit to the locals. So, the game changer has become a debt changer. Let's fast forward to the last couple of years. The situation has gone from bad to catastrophic. In 2022, Imran Khan, the cricket star turned prime minister, was ousted in a vote of no confidence. He claimed it was a U.S. conspiracy. He took to the streets. His supporters clashed with the army. For the first time, people were openly attacking military installations. The illusion of the military's invincibility was cracked. Political instability hit a peak. Who runs the country? Is it the PDM coalition? Is it the judges? Is it the general? No one knew. And while they were fighting for the throne, the economy was burning. Then, nature struck. The 2022 floods. A third of the country was underwater. 33 million people affected. Billions of dollars in damage. It was biblical. It wiped out crops. It washed away roads. For a country already on its knees, this was a body blow. Inflation skyrocketed. We are talking about the price of flour doubling. People dying in stampedes at government distribution centers just to get a bag of subsidized flour. Think about that. A nuclear power where people are trampled to death for a bag of wheat. It is a tragedy of epic proportions. The foreign exchange reserves fell to dangerous levels, at one point barely enough to cover 2 weeks of imports. Containers full of goods were stuck at the port because banks didn't have dollars to pay for them. Factories shut down because they couldn't import raw materials. Toyota, Suzuki, Honda, they all paused production in Pakistan. So why is Pakistan so poor? It's not because it lacks resources. It's not because the people aren't hard-working. Pakistani immigrants in the U.S. and U.K. are among the most successful communities. It is a failure of the system. It is a failure of the elite who chose rent-seeking over innovation. It is a failure of the military that chose strategic depth and proxy wars over economic stability. It is a failure of the political class that treats the national treasury as a personal piggy bank. It is a failure to tax the rich. It is a failure to educate the poor. Compare this to Bangladesh. In 1971, when East Pakistan broke away to become Bangladesh, the legendary statesman Henry Kissinger called it a basket case. Pakistan was the richer brother. Pakistan had the industry, the army, the cities. Bangladesh had nothing but floods and poverty. Today, Bangladesh's GDP per capita is higher than Pakistan's. Their currency is stronger. Their exports, garments, are booming. They educated their women. They controlled their population growth. They kept the army out of politics, and they zoomed past Pakistan. That hurts. That really hurts the Pakistani psyche. So what is the solution? Is there a way out? Economists have been screaming the solution for years. It's not rocket science. First, normalize trade with India. You have a billion-person market right next door, but you refuse to trade with them because of Kashmir. It's economic suicide. The EU was formed by countries that killed millions of each other's citizens in World War II. They traded their way to peace. Pakistan needs to trade with its neighbors. Second, tax the holy cows. Tax agriculture. Tax real estate. Tax the retailers who pay nothing. If the elite don't pay, the state collapses. Third, fix the energy sector. Stop the subsidies. Privatize the bleeding state-owned enterprises like PIA, the national airline, and the steel mills, which lose billions every year just by existing. Fourth, invest in women. You cannot develop a country when half your population is kept at home. Bangladesh unleashed its female workforce in the garment sector. Pakistan needs to do the same. But all of these require political will. They require the elite to sacrifice some of their perks. They require the military to take a step back. And right now, looking at the current landscape, that seems unlikely. The current strategy seems to be, get another IMF bailout, borrow some money from Saudi Arabia and China, roll over the debt, and hope for a miracle. This is known as kicking the can down the road. But the road has ended. There is a concept in economics called the Dutch disease, where a resource boom makes other industries uncompetitive. Pakistan has The geopolitical curse. Because it is so strategically important, because it has nuclear weapons, the world, the US, China, the Gulf states, keeps bailing it out. They fear a nuclear-armed state collapsing into anarchy, so they write the check. This safety net has allowed Pakistan's elite to avoid making the hard choices. Why fix the house when Uncle Sam or Uncle She will pay the rent? But patience is running thin. The Saudis have said, "No more free money. We want investment returns." The Chinese are worried about their loans. The IMF is imposing stricter and stricter conditions. The party is over. One of the most heartbreaking aspects of this economic failure is the brain drain. Go to a hospital in London, you'll find Pakistani doctors. Go to a tech firm in Silicon Valley, you'll find Pakistani engineers. The brightest minds are leaving. In 2023 alone, nearly 1 million Pakistanis left the country for work. They are voting with their feet. They don't see a future at home. When your best asset, your people, are fleeing, you know you are in deep trouble. Let's talk a bit about the Islamic aspect of the economy. Pakistan tried to implement Islamic banking and finance at various points. But often, religion is used as a tool for political legitimacy rather than economic justice. For example, the Federal Shariat Court ruled that interest, riba, is unconstitutional. But the entire global financial system is based on interest. How do you integrate with the world while banning the mechanism that makes the world go round? It creates uncertainty. It creates a legal limbo that scares investors. And then there is the terrorism factor. We can't ignore it. After 9/11, Pakistan became the front line of the war on terror. It lost 80,000 lives. It lost over $120 billion in economic losses. Foreign cricket teams stopped visiting for a decade. Hotels were bombed. Investors fled. You cannot have a thriving tourism industry or foreign investment when CNN is showing bombs going off in your cities every week. While security has improved significantly in recent years, the perception lingers. And perception is reality in economics. But let's not just bash the politicians and generals. The society itself has deep structural issues. The Seth culture in business, where family-owned businesses refuse to modernize or list on the stock exchange because they don't want to lose control or disclose their accounts. The lack of a savings culture Pakistanis love to consume. The savings rate in Pakistan is one of the lowest in the region. If you don't save, banks don't have money to lend for investment. Look at Vietnam, a country destroyed by war. Yet it reformed. It opened up. It became an export powerhouse. Pakistan had a head start on all of them. In the 1960s, South Korea modeled its development plans on Pakistan. Yes, you heard that right. Seoul copied Karachi. Now, South Korea is a G20 economy, and Pakistan is begging the IMF for $1 billion. It is a tragic fall from grace. Is there hope? There is always hope. Pakistan has a resilient, informal economy. If you walk through the markets of Lahore or Karachi, they are buzzing. People are buying, selling, trading. The official GDP numbers might understate the reality because so much activity is off the books to avoid taxes. But an informal economy cannot build dams or highways or universities. That needs the state. The tech sector is a small glimmer of hope. Freelancers in Pakistan are earning millions of dollars online. They are bypassing the broken local system and working directly for global clients. This digital economy is growing fast, but it's still too small to save the whole ship. What needs to happen is a grand bargain. The political parties, the military, the judiciary, and the business elite need to sit in a room and agree on a charter of economy, a set of economic rules that won't change no matter who is in power. They need to agree that for the next 15 years, we will focus on exports, we will tax the rich, and we will not play politics with the economy. But in a country where politics is a blood sport, where throwing your opponent in jail is the standard operating procedure, such a consensus seems like a fantasy. Let's dig deeper into the textile industry, the backbone of Pakistan's exports. For years, the government gave them cheap gas and electricity. They got addicted to it. They didn't invest in new machinery. They didn't innovate. Now that the government can no longer afford the subsidies, the textile mills are shutting down. They are crying foul. But the truth is, they were on life support for too long. Meanwhile, Bangladesh invested in labor productivity and safety standards, and they took the market share. It's a classic case of infant industry protection gone wrong. The infant never grew up. It just got old and fat. And water. We haven't talked enough about water. Pakistan is a water-stressed country. The agriculture sector uses 90% of the water, but contributes only 20% to GDP. They use flood irrigation, basically flooding the fields, which is the most wasteful method possible. Why? Because water is almost free for farmers. If they priced water correctly, farmers would switch to drip irrigation. They would grow high-value crops instead of thirsty crops like sugarcane. But the sugar barons are in parliament, so that doesn't happen. It all comes back to politics. Bad economics is almost always the result of bad politics. In Pakistan, the politics is feudal, dynastic, and militarized. It is designed to extract resources for the few, not to develop the nation for the many. Acemoglu and Robinson wrote a book called Why Nations Fail. They talk about extractive institutions versus inclusive institutions. Pakistan is the poster child for extractive institutions. The elite extracts wealth from the country and parks it in Dubai or London real estate. They have no skin in the game. If the country collapses, they have a second passport. The poor man in Karachi does not. So, when you see the headlines about Pakistan's nuclear missiles, remember the other side of the coin. Remember the malnutrition statistics. 40% of children in Pakistan are stunted. That means their brains and bodies haven't developed properly because of a lack of food. That is the future workforce of the country. Stunted. It is a tragedy because Pakistan has everything it needs to succeed. It has the mountains for tourism, the rivers for agriculture, the coast for trade, and the people for labor. It just lacks the software to run the hardware. The software of governance, of rule of law, of fair taxation. The story of Pakistan's economy is a warning to the rest of the developing world. It is a warning that military strength does not equal national strength, that debt is not a substitute for revenue, that you cannot ignore human development forever. As we look at the charts, the red lines going down, the debt mounting up, one has to wonder, is this the bottom? Or is there further to fall? Default is a scary word. Sri Lanka defaulted. It was painful, but it forced them to reset. Maybe Pakistan needs that reset. Maybe the constant bailouts are just enabling the addiction. But a default in a nuclear-armed country of 240 million people is a terrifying prospect for the world. That is why the bailouts keep coming. It is the too big to fail theory applied to a nation-state. But being too big to fail doesn't mean you are succeeding. It just means you are being kept alive in a coma. In conclusion, Pakistan is not poor because it is destined to be. It is poor because of choices. Choices made by its leaders, its generals, its judges, and its elite over 75 years. They chose conflict over trade. They chose elite privilege over public welfare. They chose aid over reform. And until they make different choices, the poorest nuclear power will remain a cautionary tale, a land of missed opportunities, where the rich get richer, the poor get desperate, and the bomb sits in the basement while the lights go out upstairs. It's a harsh reality, but it's one that needs to be faced, because the first step to solving a problem is admitting you have one, and Pakistan has a big one. This brings us to the end of our deep dive. It's a heavy topic, I know. But economics isn't just about numbers. It's about people's lives. It's about why a father can't afford medicine, or why a graduate is driving a rickshaw. If you found this analysis interesting, or if it made you angry, or if it made you think, that's the point. We need to talk about these things. Thanks for sticking around for this long analysis. This video was researched and compiled from many sources and personal observations. If there are any errors, or if you want to add your own insights, please comment below. I'm Long. Don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss any videos. Goodbye, and see you again. Hey guys, let me tell you about one of the most fascinating and, honestly, one of the most exhaustingly complicated periods in Chinese history. I'm talking about the Three Kingdoms era, that stretch of decades in the late 2nd and early 3rd centuries that gave rise to some of the most celebrated figures in all of East Asian culture. Now, I know what you're thinking. You've probably heard the romanticized version, the one with sworn brothers in a peach garden and genius strategists summoning winds and fire. But the actual political history? The real events and the real leaders? That's a different story entirely. And in some ways, it's even more interesting, precisely because it's messier, more human, and far less neat than any novel could make it. To understand the Three Kingdoms, you absolutely have to understand what came before, because this period didn't just appear out of nowhere. It grew, like a tumor, out of the slow institutional rot of the Eastern Han dynasty. The Han dynasty is one of the great empires of world history, lasting in its two phases from 206 BCE all the way to 220 CE. By the time we get to the 2nd century CE, the Eastern Han had been in power for roughly 150 years, and things were not going well. The problems were structural, deeply embedded in the way the government operated, and they had been building for generations. Let me start with the emperors themselves, because that's where the trouble really begins. The Eastern Han had a recurring and devastating problem with child emperors. When an emperor died young, which happened with alarming frequency, his successor was often a boy, sometimes an infant. A child cannot govern an empire, obviously, so power would fall into the hands of whoever controlled access to the young emperor. This typically meant two groups: the Empress Dowager's family, known as the consort clan or the maternal relatives, and the palace eunuchs, who were the only men besides the emperor allowed to live within the inner palace. These two factions, the consort families and the eunuchs, became locked in a destructive cycle that repeated itself over and over throughout the Eastern Han. A young emperor would ascend the throne, and his mother's relatives would dominate the court, appointing their allies to key positions and enriching themselves. Then, as the emperor grew older and began to resent being a puppet, he would turn to the only people he actually knew and trusted, the eunuchs who had been around him his entire life. The eunuchs would help the emperor strike against the consort family, often with lethal force, and then the eunuchs themselves would become the dominant faction at court. Then that emperor would die, a new child emperor would take the throne, a new consort family would rise, and the whole miserable cycle would start again. By the middle of the 2nd century, this pattern had corroded the government from the inside. The eunuchs had accumulated enormous power and were widely despised by the Confucian scholar officials who staffed the imperial bureaucracy. These officials saw themselves as the rightful administrators of the empire, men who had earned their positions through education and moral cultivation, and they viewed the eunuchs as corrupt, uneducated parasites who had gained power through proximity to the emperor rather than through merit. The tension between these groups erupted into open conflict during what are known as the partisan prohibitions of 166 and 169 CE. During the partisan prohibitions, the eunuch faction convinced Emperor Huan and then Emperor Ling that the scholar officials were forming dangerous political cliques. Hundreds of officials and intellectuals were arrested, banned from holding office, and, in some cases, executed. The Confucian literati were essentially purged from government, and the eunuchs consolidated their grip on power. This was a catastrophe for the Han state because it removed many of the competent administrators and replaced institutional governance with factional patronage. The people who actually knew how to run the empire were sitting at home in forced retirement, while the people running things were primarily interested in enriching themselves. Emperor Ling, who reigned from 168 to 189 CE, was particularly disastrous. He was not a child emperor in the traditional sense, having ascended at the age of 12, but he showed little interest in governing and allowed the eunuchs virtually free rein. He famously sold government offices openly, treating positions of public trust as revenue sources. If you wanted to be a provincial governor, you could literally buy the position. This meant that the men governing the provinces were often not the most capable or the most principled, but simply the wealthiest. And once in office, they naturally squeezed the population to recoup their investment and turn a profit. Corruption cascaded downward through every level of administration. Meanwhile, ordinary people were suffering enormously. The late 2nd century saw a series of natural disasters, floods, droughts, and plagues that devastated the countryside. The tax burden on peasant farmers was crushing, and local officials, many of whom had bought their positions, showed little interest in providing relief. Banditry increased. Displaced populations wandered the roads. The social fabric was fraying. And into this vacuum stepped religious movements that offered something the Han government no longer could: hope, community, and a sense that the world's suffering had meaning and would eventually end. The most significant of these movements was the Way of Great Peace, led by a man named Zhang Jue. Zhang Jue was a faith healer and religious leader who had built a massive following across 8 provinces in northern and central China. His movement combined elements of Taoist philosophy, folk religion, and millenarian prophecy. Zhang Jue taught that the Han dynasty had lost the mandate of heaven, that the era of the blue heaven was ending, and that a new era of the yellow heaven was about to begin. His followers wore yellow turbans as a symbol of this coming transformation, which is why the rebellion they launched is known as the Yellow Turban Rebellion. In 184 CE, Zhang Ju and his brothers launched a coordinated uprising across a vast swath of the empire. The scale was enormous. Hundreds of thousands of followers rose simultaneously, attacking government offices, burning towns, and overwhelming local garrisons. The Han court was caught off guard, and the initial response was chaotic. Emperor Ling and his advisors realized that the regular military establishment was inadequate to deal with a rebellion of this magnitude. So they did something that would have profound consequences. They authorized local strongmen, provincial officials, and wealthy landowners to raise their own private armies to fight the Yellow Turbans. This decision was the single most important political event in the prelude to the Three Kingdoms, and I cannot overstate its significance. By decentralizing military power and allowing individuals to raise and command their own forces, the Han court was essentially creating the warlords who would tear the empire apart. Once a man had his own army, his own officers, and his own logistical network, he had the foundation of an independent power base. Getting him to give all that up once the crisis passed would prove impossible. The Yellow Turban Rebellion was suppressed relatively quickly in its main phase, largely because Zhang Ju died of illness partway through the uprising, and because the rebel forces, though numerous, were poorly trained and organized compared to the professional soldiers and local militias arrayed against them. But the rebellion was never truly extinguished. Yellow Turban remnants continued to cause trouble for years, and similar uprisings broke out in other parts of the empire. More importantly, the damage was done. The military landscape of China had been permanently altered. Among those who gained prominence fighting the Yellow Turbans were several figures who would become central to the Three Kingdoms story. Cao Cao, a young official from a wealthy but politically suspect family, his father had been adopted by a eunuch, distinguished himself as a capable military leader during the campaign. Liu Bei, a man of humble origins who claimed distant descent from the Han imperial family, began gathering followers and building his reputation. Sun Jian, a fierce warrior from the south, earned renown for his aggressive campaigning against the rebels. These men were still minor figures in 184, but the Yellow Turban Rebellion gave them their start. The rebellion also accelerated the institutional collapse of the Han government. In its aftermath, the court restructured provincial administration, creating larger military provinces called mu, or regional inspectorates with greater autonomous power. The idea was to make provincial leaders more capable of responding to local threats without waiting for central directives. But the practical effect was to give provincial governors even more independence and even less reason to defer to the capital. Now, let me take you to the year 189, because this is when everything truly falls apart. Emperor Ling died in the spring of that year, and the succession was immediately contested. Ling had 2 sons, the elder, Liu Bian, whose mother was Empress He, and the younger, Liu Shi, who had been raised by Emperor Ling's mother and was reportedly the emperor's preferred successor. The court split between supporters of the 2 princes, and Empress He's faction prevailed, placing Liu Bian on the throne as Emperor Shao. The key power broker behind this was He Jin, Empress He's half-brother, who held the position of General-in-Chief, the highest military office in the empire. He Jin was a butcher's son, who had risen to prominence entirely through his sister's position, and he was not a particularly skilled political operator. But he was the most powerful man at court, and he had a plan. He wanted to eliminate the eunuch faction once and for all. The eunuchs had been scheming to place the younger prince on the throne,
and He Jin saw them as a permanent threat to his family's position. He Jin's plan was straightforward, but incredibly dangerous. He decided to summon Dong Zhuo, a frontier general with a large army, to march on the capital city of Luoyang and intimidate the eunuchs into submission. Several of his advisors, including the brilliant young official Cao Cao, warned him that this was an extraordinarily bad idea. Inviting a powerful warlord with his own army into the capital was like inviting a wolf into a sheep pen. But He Jin was convinced that military force was necessary, and he went ahead with the plan. Before Dong Zhuo could arrive, however, the eunuchs struck first. In September 189, the eunuch faction, learning of He Jin's plans to destroy them, lured He Jin into the palace and assassinated him. When news of the assassination reached He Jin's officers, they stormed the palace in a frenzy of violence, massacring every eunuch they could find. The killing was indiscriminate. Soldiers reportedly killed any man who appeared to be beardless, on the assumption that he might be a eunuch. Over 2,000 people were slaughtered in a single night. The eunuch faction, which had been a dominant force in Han politics for over a century, was annihilated. But the chaos was not over. During the confusion, the young Emperor Shao and his brother Prince Shi fled the palace and were found wandering in the countryside by none other than Dong Zhuo, who was arriving with his army in response to He Jin's now pointless summons. Dong Zhuo took custody of the two young princes and marched into Luoyang at the head of his troops. In a single stroke, he had gained control of the emperor himself, which in the political logic of the Han dynasty meant he had gained control of the empire. Dong Zhuo was a terrifying figure. He was a career military man from the northwestern frontier, physically imposing, ruthless, and utterly uninterested in the niceties of Confucian governance. He had spent his career fighting the Chong people on the border and had built his power base through personal loyalty networks with his soldiers. He had no connection to the court establishment, no respect for its traditions, and no intention of sharing power. Within weeks of his arrival, Dong Zhuo made a series of moves that shocked the political class. He deposed the young Emperor Shao and replaced him with the even younger Prince Shi, who became Emperor Xian, the last emperor of the Han dynasty. Dong Zhuo chose Liu Xie specifically because the boy was younger and more pliable, and because He Jin's faction had supported Liu Bian, which gave Dong Zhuo a pretext for the change. A few months later, Dong Zhuo had the deposed Emperor Shao and Empress He both murdered, eliminating any potential rallying point for opposition. Dong Zhuo ruled through raw intimidation. He stationed his troops throughout Luoyang and its environs, and his soldiers behaved more like an occupation force than a national army. He appointed and dismissed officials at will, executed anyone he perceived as a threat, and indulged in grotesque displays of cruelty to cow the population. He forced high-ranking officials to attend banquets where prisoners were tortured and executed as entertainment. The message was clear. Dong Zhuo held absolute power, and resistance would be met with extreme violence. But Dong Zhuo made one move that was politically shrewd, even if it was primarily motivated by self-interest. He appointed several prominent and capable men to positions of authority, men like Kai Yang, one of the most respected scholars of the age, and even initially treated some members of the old establishment with a degree of courtesy. He also promoted a young, ambitious officer named Lu Bu to be his chief bodyguard and enforcer. Lu Bu was perhaps the most formidable individual warrior of his generation, and his loyalty, or rather his appearance of loyalty, gave Dong Zhuo an additional layer of security. Meanwhile, the officials who had fled Luoyang began organizing resistance. In early 190, a coalition of regional leaders formed an alliance against Dong Zhuo.
This coalition is often called the Alliance Against Dong Zhuo, and it included many of the men who would become the major players of the Three Kingdoms period. Yuan Shao, a scion of one of the most powerful families in the empire, the Yuan family of Runan, was named the leader of the coalition. His younger cousin, Yuan Shu, also joined, as did Cao Cao, Sun Jian, and numerous provincial governors and military commanders. On paper, this was an overwhelming force. In practice, it was a dysfunctional mess. The coalition members were united only by their opposition to Dong Zhuo, and they had wildly different agendas, ambitions, and levels of commitment. Many of them were more interested in positioning themselves for the post-Dong Zhuo power struggle than in actually fighting Dong Zhuo. Yuan Shao and Yuan Shu despised each other. Several coalition members simply sat in their camps, consuming supplies and making no move to attack. Only a handful of leaders actually engaged Dong Zhuo's forces, and of these, Sun Jian was by far the most aggressive and effective. Dong Zhuo, for his part, responded to the coalition by making a decision that would echo through Chinese history. He forcibly relocated the entire population of Luoyang, hundreds of thousands of people, to the western city of Chang'an, where he could be closer to his northwestern power base. And then he burned Luoyang to the ground. The imperial palaces, the government archives, the great houses of the nobility, the markets and homes and temples, all of it was put to the torch. Luoyang, which had been the capital of the Eastern Han for nearly 2 centuries, was reduced to ashes and rubble. It was an act of staggering destruction, and it served as a brutal symbol of just how far the Han order had fallen. The coalition against Dong Zhuo eventually fell apart without achieving its stated goal of removing him from power. But Dong Zhuo's own days were numbered. In 192, he was assassinated by his own bodyguard, Lu Bu, in a conspiracy orchestrated by the court official Wang Yun. The assassination was a palace coup, carried out with a spear thrust as Dong Zhuo arrived at court. Lu Bu had been turned against his master through a combination of personal grievances and political manipulation. Dong Zhuo's death was met with jubilation, and his body was reportedly left in the street, where people placed a wick in his navel and lit it, the fat of his corpulent body burning for days like a candle. But Dong Zhuo's death did not restore order. It merely created another vacuum. His former generals, men like Li Jue and Guo Si, marched on Chang'an, killed Wang Yun, drove out Lu Bu, and seized control of the emperor themselves. The cycle of warlord domination continued, and Emperor Xian remained a puppet, passed from one strong man to another. China was now effectively without a functioning central government. The provinces were on their own, and the men who controlled them were free to pursue their own ambitions. This, then, was the political landscape at the dawn of the Three Kingdoms era. A powerless emperor, a devastated capital, a fragmented military, and a generation of ambitious, capable, and ruthless leaders who saw an empire ripe for the taking. The stage was set. The years following Dong Zhuo's assassination were, if anything, more chaotic than the years preceding it. The coalition that had briefly united against Zhuo had long since dissolved, and the men who had nominally served the Han dynasty as governors, generals, and administrators now operated as independent warlords, each controlling whatever territory they could hold by force. The emperor existed, technically, in Chang'an, under the control of Li Jue and Guo Si, who spent as much time fighting each other as they did governing. The imperial court had become a theater of humiliation, with Emperor Xian subjected to indignities that would have been unthinkable a generation earlier. Ministers were killed in his presence. He was forced to flee the ruined capital on foot at one point, his retinue starving and ragged. The Son of Heaven had become, in practical terms, a refugee in his own empire.
It was into this situation that Cao Cao made his most consequential political calculation. Cao Cao was, by the mid-1900s, already a significant figure, though not yet the dominant one. He had participated in the coalition against Dong Zhuo, though his contribution had been modest and his forces had been badly mauled in an early engagement. After the coalition's dissolution, he had returned to the eastern provinces and begun building his power base through a combination of military campaigning and shrewd administration. He defeated bands of Yellow Turban remnants in Yen province, absorbing their surrendered troops into his own army, which gave him both manpower and a territorial foothold. He was not, at this stage, the most powerful warlord in northern China. That distinction belonged to Yuan Shao, who controlled a vast swath of territory north of the Yellow River and commanded the largest and best-supplied army in the region. But Cao Cao was building something, and he was building it with a degree of political sophistication that most of his rivals lacked. The decision that transformed Cao Cao from a regional warlord into the preeminent political figure in northern China was his decision to welcome Emperor Xian and relocate the imperial court to Shu, which he controlled. This happened in 196, and it was not an act of loyalty. It was an act of political genius. By housing the emperor, Cao Cao gained the ability to issue edicts in the emperor's name. He could appoint and dismiss officials. He could declare rivals to be rebels against the throne. He could frame every military campaign as an act of imperial restoration rather than personal aggrandizement. The phrase that later historians would use to describe this strategy was, "using the emperor to command the lords," and it was devastatingly effective. Cao Cao understood, perhaps better than anyone else of his generation, that legitimacy still mattered. The Han dynasty might have been functionally dead, but its symbolic authority was not. Men still respected the idea of the emperor, even if they did not respect the specific man who held the title. By controlling access to that symbol, Cao Cao gave himself an advantage that no amount of military force alone could provide. Not everyone agreed that this was a wise move. Some of Cao Cao's own advisors warned him that hosting the emperor would be a burden, that it would invite scrutiny and constrain his freedom of action. They were not entirely wrong. The emperor's presence did create complications. Court officials loyal to the Han had to be managed, placated, or eliminated. The fiction of imperial authority had to be maintained, which meant that Cao Cao had to operate through a layer of bureaucratic protocol that other warlords could simply ignore. But Cao Cao judged correctly that the benefits outweighed the costs, and he was patient enough to manage the complications as they arose. The relocation of the emperor to Shu also established a pattern that would define Cao Cao's political career.
the careful maintenance of the appearance of Han legitimacy while steadily accumulating real power for himself. Cao Cao never declared himself emperor. He never formally abolished the Han dynasty.
He accepted titles and honors, first as a marquis, later as a duke, and finally, near the end of his life, as King of Wei. But he always accepted them from the emperor, as though they were gifts rather than demands. This was not modesty, it was calculation. Cao Cao understood that seizing the throne outright would unite his enemies against him in a way that his current arrangement did not. As long as he was technically a Han minister, however powerful, his rivals could not easily claim the moral high ground of defending the dynasty against a usurper. They could call him a tyrant, a bully, a manipulator, and they did, but they could not call him a rebel, because the emperor himself had sanctioned his position. This brings us to Yuan Shao, who was, in many ways, Cao Cao's opposite and his most dangerous rival. Yuan Shao came from what was perhaps the most prestigious family in the empire. The Yuans had produced ministers and officials for 4 generations, and the family's network of connections extended across every level of Han government. Where Cao Cao's background was respectable but somewhat tainted, his grandfather had been a eunuch, a fact that his enemies never let him forget. Yuan Shao's pedigree was impeccable. He was handsome, well-spoken, and carried himself with the confidence of a man who had never doubted his right to lead. He had been the nominal head of the coalition against Dong Zhuo, and after the coalition's collapse, he had methodically conquered the northern provinces, defeating rivals like Gongsun Zan and consolidating a territory that stretched from the Yellow River to the borders of the northern steppes. By the late 190s, Yuan Shao controlled 4 provinces and commanded an army that significantly outnumbered Cao Cao's. On paper, he was the stronger of the two. His territory was larger, his army was bigger, his family name carried more weight. And yet, Yuan Shao suffered from a set of political and personal weaknesses that would prove fatal. The first was indecisiveness. Yuan Shao had a well-documented tendency to deliberate endlessly, to seek consensus among his advisors, and to choose the safest option rather than the boldest one. This was not always a flaw. Caution has its place. But in the fluid, high-stakes environment of late Han politics, hesitation could be as dangerous as recklessness. When Cao Cao welcomed the emperor to Su in 196, several of Yuan Shao's advisors urged him to do the same, or at least to contest Cao Cao's control of the imperial court. Yuan Shao declined. He judged that having the emperor would be more trouble than it was worth. This was arguably the single greatest strategic miscalculation of his career. The second weakness was Yuan Shao's inability to manage his own subordinates. His court was riven by factional disputes, with advisors divided into competing camps that spent as much energy undermining each other as they did advising their lord. Men like Tian Feng and Zhu Shu, who were among the most capable strategists in northern China, found their counsel repeatedly overruled by rivals who told Yuan Shao what he wanted to hear rather than what he needed to hear. Tian Feng, in particular, warned Yuan Shao against attacking Cao Cao prematurely and was imprisoned for his trouble. The pattern was consistent. Yuan Shao surrounded himself with talented people, but lacked the ability or the willingness to adjudicate their disputes effectively. The result was a court that was perpetually at war with itself. The third weakness was more personal. Yuan Shao could not resolve the question of his succession. He had multiple sons, and he favored his youngest, Yuan Shang, over his eldest, Yuan Tan.
This preference created a factional divide within his own family and among his officials, with different advisors backing different sons. The succession question poisoned Yuan Shao's court from within and would, after his death, tear his domain apart entirely. But even before that, it sapped the coherence of his political and military decision-making.
The confrontation between Cao Cao and Yuan Shao came to a head at the Battle of Guandu in 200. This was the decisive engagement of the northern campaigns, and it is worth examining not just as a military event, but as a political one. The lead-up to Guandu was shaped by political maneuvering as much as by troop movements. Cao Cao, aware that he was outnumbered, worked to neutralize potential threats on his flanks before the main engagement. He conducted a rapid campaign against Liu Bei, who had briefly occupied Su province and posed a threat to Cao Cao's rear. He negotiated with, bribed, or intimidated minor warlords along his borders to ensure their neutrality. He also relied heavily on the legitimacy conferred by his control of the emperor, issuing edicts that framed Yuan Shao's advance as an act of rebellion against the throne. This was, strictly speaking, absurd. Everyone knew that Cao Cao controlled the emperor and that the edicts reflected Cao Cao's will rather than the emperor's, but it mattered nonetheless. Legitimacy, even manufactured legitimacy, had a weight of its own. Yuan Shao, for his part, assembled an enormous army and marched south. His numerical advantage was significant, perhaps 2 or 3 to 1, depending on which sources one trusts. His supply lines were longer but better provisioned. He had every material advantage. What he lacked was a unified command structure and a clear strategic vision. His advisors disagreed about how to prosecute the campaign. Some urged a direct assault on Cao Cao's main position. Others recommended flanking maneuvers or a strategy of attrition. Yuan Shao vacillated between these options, committing fully to none of them. The battle itself was a prolonged affair, stretching over several months. Cao Cao fortified a position at Guandu and held it against repeated assaults. But his situation was precarious. His supplies were running low, and his troops were exhausted. He reportedly considered retreating. It was at this critical juncture that a defector from Yuan Shao's camp, Su Yu, arrived with intelligence about the location of Yuan Shao's main supply depot at Wuchao. Cao Cao made the decision, bold, risky, and against the advice of some of his own officers, to personally lead a raiding force against the depot. The raid succeeded. Yuan Shao's supplies were destroyed, and his army, deprived of food and materiel, collapsed. The defeat was total. Guandu was not the end of Yuan Shao. He retreated north with the remnants of his army and still controlled significant territory. But it broke his momentum and his spirit. He died in 202, possibly of illness exacerbated by the stress of defeat, and his domain immediately fractured as his sons turned on each other. Yuan Tan and Yuan Shang fought a bitter civil war that Cao Cao exploited with ruthless efficiency, supporting one side and then the other, weakening both and ultimately absorbing their territories piecemeal. By 207, Cao Cao had conquered the last remnants of the Yuan domain and was the undisputed master of northern China. The political significance of Cao Cao's victory in the north cannot be overstated. He had unified the most economically productive and strategically important region of the empire under a single authority. He had done so through a combination of military skill, political cunning, and administrative competence. And he had done so while maintaining the fiction of Han legitimacy, which gave his regime a degree of stability and institutional continuity that purely military conquests rarely enjoy. Cao Cao's administration of the north was, by the standards of the era, remarkably effective. He implemented agricultural reforms, including a system of military farming colonies that allowed his troops to be self-sustaining rather than dependent on taxation and requisition from an already devastated civilian population. He promoted officials based on ability rather than family background, which was a significant departure from the norms of Han society. He was not egalitarian in any modern sense. His regime was authoritarian and often brutal, but he was pragmatic. He wanted men who could govern, fight, and produce results, and he was willing to overlook social stigma, personal eccentricities, and even past disloyalty if a man had talent. This policy attracted a steady stream of capable administrators and strategists to his service, and gave his government a depth of institutional competence that his rivals struggled to match. But Cao Cao's success in the north also created the conditions for the three-way division that would define the next half-century of Chinese history. His very dominance forced his remaining rivals, Liu Bei in the west and Sun Quan in the southeast, to recognize that they could not defeat him individually. The logic of the situation pushed them toward alliance,
toward cooperation against the common threat. And it was this logic that would produce the next great turning point, the confrontation at the Red Cliffs, which would determine whether Cao Cao could complete his conquest of the empire, or whether China would be divided among three competing states. That confrontation, and the political calculations that shaped it, would prove to be the defining moment of the era. The year 208 marked the moment when the trajectory of the era shifted from consolidation toward permanent division. Cao Cao, having spent the better part of a decade securing the north, turned his attention southward. He had good reason to believe that the remaining opposition could be swept aside. His armies were enormous, his administrative apparatus was functioning, and his most recent campaign had delivered Jing Province, the strategic middle ground of the empire, almost without a fight. Liu Biao, the governor of Jing Province, had died, and his younger son, Liu Cong, had surrendered to Cao Cao rather than face a battle he could not win. The dominoes appeared to be falling in sequence, but the surrender of Jing Province, while a political windfall for Cao Cao, also set in motion the chain of events that would ultimately check his ambition. Liu Bei, who had been sheltering in Jing Province as a guest of Liu Biao, was forced to flee south with whatever forces and followers he could gather. His retreat was desperate and disorganized. He moved through the province with a column of civilian refugees trailing behind him, slowing his movement and making him vulnerable to Cao Cao's pursuing cavalry.
At the Battle of Changban, Cao Cao's riders caught up with Liu Bei's column and scattered it. Liu Bei escaped with a small retinue, but the incident underscored just how precarious his position had become. It was at this moment of maximum vulnerability that the diplomatic foundations of the three-way division were laid. Liu Bei's advisor, Zhuge Liang, who had joined Liu Bei's cause only the previous year, traveled to the court of Sun Quan in the southeast to propose a military alliance against Cao Cao. The proposal was straightforward in its strategic logic. Neither Liu Bei nor Sun Quan could resist Cao Cao alone, but together they might be able to stop him at the Yangtze River, where his numerical superiority would be offset by the difficulties of naval warfare and unfamiliar terrain. Surrender would preserve their positions, their wealth, and their lives. It was the safe choice, the conservative choice, and it carried the weight of political realism. The opposing faction, led by the general Zhou Yu and the advisor Lu Su, argued that submission was an illusion of safety. Cao Cao might accept Sun Quan's surrender graciously, but there would be no guarantee that he would allow the Sun family to retain meaningful power. The precedents were not encouraging. Cao Cao had a habit of absorbing surrendered territories into his own administrative structure, replacing local power holders with his own appointees. A man like Sun Quan, who had his own military forces and his own base of support, would always be a potential threat in Cao Cao's eyes. Submission might delay the reckoning, but it would not prevent it. Zhou Yu made the additional military argument that Cao Cao's army, while large, was not invincible in the specific conditions of a Yangtze campaign. His troops were predominantly northern, unfamiliar with riverine warfare. Many of them were recently incorporated forces from Jing province, whose loyalty was uncertain. The supply lines stretching back to the north would be long and vulnerable. And disease, always a factor when northern armies campaigned in the humid south, could erode his strength faster than any battle. Sun Quan sided with the war faction. The decision was partly strategic, partly temperamental. Sun Quan was not a man inclined to subordinate himself to anyone, and the prospect of spending the rest of his life as a nominal subject of Cao Cao, dependent on another man's goodwill for his continued existence, was fundamentally unappealing. He committed his forces to the alliance with Liu Bei and appointed Zhou Yu to command the combined fleet. The campaign that followed, the Battle of the Red Cliffs, or Chibi, has been mythologized beyond recognition in Chinese literary tradition. But the underlying political and military realities were significant enough without embellishment. The combined forces of Sun Quan and Liu Bei met Cao Cao's army along the Yangtze River, probably somewhere near modern Wuhan, in the winter of 208 to 209. The exact details of the engagement are debated by historians, as the sources are inconsistent and were written well after the fact. What is reasonably clear is that Cao Cao's fleet was destroyed, largely by fire, and that his army suffered significant losses from a combination of battle, disease, and logistical collapse. Cao Cao retreated northward. He would never again mount a serious attempt to conquer the south. The significance of the Red Cliffs was not primarily military, but political. The battle demonstrated that the Yangtze River was a defensible boundary, that a competent naval power in the south could prevent a northern land power from projecting force across the river. This was not a new lesson in Chinese history. The Yangtze had served as a dividing line before, and it would do so again in later centuries. But in the specific context of the late Han collapse, it meant that Cao Cao's project of reunification through conquest had reached its geographical limit. He could dominate the north. He could not dominate the empire. The immediate aftermath of the Red Cliffs was a scramble for Jing province, the strategic territory that lay between the three emerging power centers. Jing province controlled the middle Yangtze and provided access to both the north and the deep south. Whoever held it would have a significant advantage in any future conflict. Liu Bei, Zhou Yu, and Cao Cao's remaining garrison commanders all competed for control of the province's various commanderies in the months and years following the battle. The result was a messy partition, with Liu Bei securing the southern commanderies, Sun Quan's forces holding the eastern portions, and Cao Cao retaining the northern districts.
This partition of Jing province was the embryo of the three-way division. It was also the seed of future conflict between the nominal allies Liu Bei and Sun Quan,
because both men understood that their alliance was contingent and temporary. A marriage of convenience against a common threat, not a permanent arrangement based on shared interests. For Liu Bei, the years immediately after the Red Cliffs represented his transformation from a wandering exile into a territorial lord. He used Jing province as a base from which to launch his conquest of Yi province, modern Sichuan, in 211 to 214. Yi province was ruled by Liu Zhang, another member of the extended Liu imperial family, who had invited Liu Bei into his territory as an ally against threats from the north. Liu Bei accepted the invitation, established himself within Yi province, and then turned on his host. It was a calculated act of betrayal, and it troubled Liu Bei's reputation as a man of virtue. But it gave him what he had never previously possessed: a defensible territory with substantial population, agricultural output, and strategic depth. The conquest of Yi province was followed by the contest for Hanzhong, a mountainous region on the border between Cao Cao's territory and Liu Bei's new domain. Hanzhong was strategically critical because it controlled the mountain passes connecting the Wei River Valley in the north with the Sichuan Basin in the south. Whoever held Hanzhong held the keys to invasion in either direction. Cao Cao had seized Hanzhong from the local warlord Zhang Lu in 215, but Liu Bei contested it in a prolonged campaign in 217 to 219 and ultimately forced Cao Cao to withdraw. The victory at Hanzhong was the high watermark of Liu Bei's military career. In the summer of 219, he assumed the title of King of Hanzhong, a deliberate echo of the first Han Emperor, Liu Bang, who had used Hanzhong as his base for conquering the empire 4 centuries earlier. But 219 was also the year when the alliance between Liu Bei and Sun Quan collapsed, with consequences that would shape the rest of the era. The trigger was Guan Yu, Liu Bei's most trusted general, who commanded the forces in Jing province while Liu Bei consolidated his hold on Yi province and Hanzhong. Guan Yu launched an ambitious offensive northward against Cao Cao's positions along the Han River, besieging the fortress of Fan and achieving significant initial success. His campaign alarmed both Cao Cao, who considered relocating his capital to escape the threat, and Sun Quan, who saw Guan Yu's advance as a destabilizing shift in the balance of power. Sun Quan made the decisive calculation that Guan Yu's success was more dangerous to his interests than Cao Cao's continued presence in the north. A triumphant Liu Bei, controlling both Yi province and all of Jing province, with a victorious army advancing into the Central Plains, would be an overwhelmingly powerful neighbor. Sun Quan's strategists had always regarded Jing province as rightfully belonging to his sphere of influence, and Guan Yu's aggressive posture — he had been dismissive and insulting in his dealings with Sun Quan's representatives — made cooperation impossible. In a coordinated operation with Cao Cao's forces, Sun Quan's general Lu Meng launched a surprise attack on Guan Yu's rear, seizing the Jing province cities that Guan Yu had left lightly defended. Guan Yu, caught between Cao Cao's army to the north and Sun Quan's forces to the south, was trapped and captured. He was executed in December 219. The loss of Guan Yu and Jing province was a catastrophe for Liu Bei on multiple levels. Militarily, it cost him his most capable field commander and the territory that connected his domain to the Central Plains. Strategically, it left him confined to the Sichuan Basin, a defensible but
isolated position from which projecting power eastward or northward would be extremely difficult. Politically, it destroyed the alliance that had been the foundation of his survival since the Red Cliffs. The events of 219 to 220 also accelerated the formalization of the three-way division. In early 220, Cao Cao died. He had never taken the final step of deposing the Han Emperor and claiming the throne for himself,
though he had accumulated every possible title and prerogative short of the imperial dignity. His son and successor, Cao Pi, was less encumbered by the political fiction. In October 220, Cao Pi compelled Emperor Xian to abdicate and established the new dynasty of Wei, with himself as its first emperor. The 4-century-old Han dynasty was formally at an end. Liu Bei responded in 221 by declaring his own dynasty, Shu Han, or the Han dynasty of Shu, claiming that he, as a member of the Liu imperial family, was the legitimate continuation of the Han. His claim rested on bloodline and on the argument that Cao Pi's seizure of the throne was illegitimate. Whether Liu Bei genuinely believed in this claim or simply recognized its political utility is unknowable, but it provided his regime with an ideological foundation that distinguished it from a mere regional warlord state. Sun Quan was slower to declare himself emperor. He initially accepted a nominal vassalage to Cao Pi's Wei dynasty, receiving the title of King of Wu. This was pure diplomatic maneuvering. Sun Quan had no intention of actually subordinating himself to Wei, but it allowed him to avoid fighting on two fronts simultaneously. He would not formally declare himself emperor until 229, when his position was secure enough that the symbolic gesture carried no practical risk. The year 221 also brought the last great military confrontation between two of the three kingdoms. Liu Bei, burning with desire to avenge Guan Yu and recapture Jing province, launched a massive invasion of Sun Quan's territory. His advisors, including Zhuge Liang, reportedly counseled against the campaign, arguing that the real enemy was Wei in the north and that the alliance with Sun Quan should be repaired rather than destroyed. Liu Bei overruled them. The campaign of 221 to 222, culminating in the Battle of Yiling, also called Xiaoting, was a disaster for Liu Bei. Sun Quan's commander, Lu Xun, a young officer who had not previously held major independent command, employed a patient defensive strategy, refusing to engage Liu Bei's forces in a decisive battle, and instead allowing them to exhaust themselves along an extended front in the difficult terrain of the Yangtze Gorges. When Liu Bei's army was sufficiently strung out and demoralized, Lu Xun launched a devastating fire attack that destroyed Liu Bei's camps and routed his army. Liu Bei retreated to Baidicheng, a fortress at the entrance to the Sichuan Basin, where he fell ill. He died there in June 223, leaving his young son Liu Shan as heir and entrusting the government to Zhuge Liang as regent. The Battle of Yiling, together with the Red Cliffs, defined the military parameters of the three-way division. The Red Cliffs had shown that the North could not conquer the South across the Yangtze. Yiling showed that the West could not conquer the Southeast along it. The geography of southern China, the rivers, the gorges, the mountains, the distances, made offensive operations across the boundaries between the three states extraordinarily difficult. The division was not merely a product of political circumstance, it was sustained by the physical landscape. With Liu Bei's death,
The first generation of the Three Kingdoms era passed from the scene.
Cao Cao had died in 220, Liu Bei in 223.
Of the three founding figures, only Sun Quan remained, and he would rule for another 3 decades. The era that followed belonged to a new set of political leaders, men who had inherited the institutions and the rivalries of their predecessors, and who would navigate the complex diplomacy of a 3-state system that none of them had the strength to overturn. The most remarkable of these second-generation leaders was Zhuge Liang, who, as chancellor and regent of Shu Han, became the dominant political figure of the 200s and 210s and 200s and 310s. His first diplomatic act after Liu Bei's death was to repair the alliance with Sun Quan, a recognition that the strategic logic of cooperation against Wei had not changed, regardless of the bitterness of the recent war. The renewed alliance would hold,
with occasional strains, for the remainder of the Three Kingdoms period. But alliance with Wu was a defensive measure. The question that defined Zhuge Liang's chancellorship was whether Shu Han could do more than simply survive, whether it could fulfill the ideological promise of its founding and actually restore the Han dynasty by conquering Wei. That question, and the campaigns Zhuge Liang launched to answer it, would consume the next decade and reveal the fundamental constraints under which the smallest of the Three Kingdoms operated. The decade following Liu Bei's death was shaped by Zhuge Liang's singular conviction that passivity meant eventual destruction. Shu Han was the smallest of the Three Kingdoms in territory, population, and economic output. Wei controlled the vast North China Plain, the heartland of Chinese civilization, with perhaps 4 times the population of Shu and proportionally greater agricultural and military resources. If both states simply developed their internal strength over time, the disparity would only widen. Zhuge Liang concluded that Shu Han had to attack, not because it was strong enough to conquer Wei in a single campaign, but because a policy of active offense might create opportunities that a policy of passive defense never would. Before he could turn north, however, Zhuge Liang had to secure his southern frontier. In 225, he personally led a campaign into the Nanzhong region, the mountainous territory in what is now Yunnan and southern Sichuan, where local leaders had risen in revolt following Liu Bei's death. The southern campaign was as much a political exercise as a military one. Zhuge Liang sought not merely to suppress the rebellion, but to establish a stable arrangement that would keep the south pacified while Shu's main armies were committed in the north. He succeeded in this aim. The indigenous leaders were brought to terms, local governance was reorganized, and the region's manpower and resources, including horses and metals, were integrated into the Shu Han war effort. The southern frontier remained largely quiet for years afterward, freeing Zhuge Liang to concentrate on what he regarded as the essential task. The first northern expedition began in the spring of 228, and it opened with Shu Han's greatest moment of strategic promise. Zhuge Liang advanced into the Wei territories of Longyu, the region west of the Wei River in modern Gansu, and several commanderies defected to him almost immediately. The speed and scale of the response suggested that Wei's hold on its northwestern territories was less secure than it appeared, and for a brief period it seemed possible that Zhuge Liang might establish a permanent Shu presence north of the Qinling Mountains. The opportunity collapsed at the Battle of Jieting. Zhuge Liang had dispatched Ma Su to hold the strategically critical town of Jieting, which controlled the route through which Wei reinforcements would approach. Ma Su, disregarding Zhuge Liang's specific instructions, positioned his forces on high ground away from the water sources rather than fortifying the road itself. The Wei general Zhang He exploited this error decisively. cutting off Ma Su's water supply and routing his army. With the flank exposed and the line of advance compromised, Zhuge Liang had no choice but to withdraw. He executed Ma Su for the failure, a decision that demonstrated his commitment to military discipline, but also deprived Shu of a talented, if flawed, officer. The loss at Jieting established a pattern that would repeat itself throughout the northern expeditions. Zhuge Liang could plan campaigns with extraordinary care, manage logistics with impressive efficiency, and maneuver armies with considerable skill. But he could not overcome the fundamental geographic and demographic realities that constrained Shu Han's military power. The Qinling Mountains and the difficult roads through them, particularly the famous plank roads built along cliff faces, made it nearly impossible to sustain a large army in offensive operations far from its base. Supply lines were long, vulnerable, and limited in capacity. Every campaign operated under severe time pressure. Zhuge Liang had to achieve decisive results before his supplies ran out, and his opponents knew this. Wei's response to the northern expeditions was shaped primarily by two men. The first was Cao Jun, a senior Wei general and member of the extended Cao family who commanded the western defenses during the early campaigns. Cao Jun understood that he did not need to defeat Zhuge Liang in pitched battle. He needed only to delay him, defend key positions, and wait for Shu's logistical constraints to force a withdrawal. This strategy was sound, but unglamorous, and Cao Jun sometimes chafed under its limitations. The second and ultimately more important figure was Sima Yi. Already a prominent political figure within Wei, Sima Yi was given military command in the west after Cao Jun's death in 231. His approach to Zhuge Liang was characterized by a patient, almost infuriating refusal to accept battle on unfavorable terms. Sima Yi fortified his positions, shadowed Zhuge Liang's movements, and consistently declined to engage when Zhuge Liang sought a decisive confrontation. This was not cowardice. Sima Yi was capable of aggressive action when circumstances warranted it, but a calculated strategy based on a clear understanding of the strategic situation. Every day that passed without a major Wei defeat was a day closer to Shu's inevitable withdrawal. Zhuge Liang launched a total of 5 northern expeditions between 228 and 234, though the numbering and counting of these campaigns varies somewhat depending on the source. The second expedition, later in 228, was a smaller affair directed against the fortress of Chensang, which proved too well defended to take. The third, in 229, was a limited operation that recovered some territory in the Wudu and Yinping commanderies. The fourth, in 231, was a more substantial campaign that saw Zhuge Liang advance deep into Wei territory and fight several engagements with Sima Yi's forces. Shu sources claim significant tactical victories in this campaign, but once again, supply problems forced Zhuge Liang to retreat before he could exploit any gains. Between campaigns, Zhuge Liang devoted enormous energy to solving the supply problem. He improved agricultural production in the Hanzhong region, which served as his forward base. He is credited, with what degree of historical accuracy is debatable, with innovations in transport technology, including an improved wheelbarrow design and the so-called wooden ox and flowing horse, devices whose exact nature has been debated by scholars for centuries, but which were apparently some form of mechanical transport aid. These efforts were genuine attempts to address the core strategic problem, but they could only mitigate, not eliminate, the geographic disadvantage under which Shu operated. The fifth and final northern expedition began in 234 and represented Zhuge Liang's most ambitious attempt to force a decision. He advanced to the Wuzhong Plains south of the Wei River and established a fortified camp. Sima Yi positioned his forces opposite and settled in for what he clearly intended to be a prolonged standoff. Zhuge Liang tried every means at his disposal to provoke Sima Yi into attacking. In one famous episode, he sent Sima Yi a gift of women's clothing, implying that his refusal to fight was unmanly. Sima Yi reportedly accepted the gift with equanimity, though accounts suggest his subordinates were considerably more agitated. The Wei court, understanding and endorsing Sima Yi's strategy, sent an official to the camp with explicit orders to avoid battle, giving Sima Yi political cover against pressure from his own officers. The standoff continued through the summer and autumn. Zhuge Liang, whose health had been deteriorating under the strain of years of campaigning and governance, fell seriously ill in his camp. He died in the autumn of 234, at the age of 53. With his death, the Shu army withdrew in good order. Zhuge Liang had characteristically prepared detailed plans for the retreat, and the northern expeditions came to an end.
Zhuge Liang's campaigns had failed in their primary objective. He had not conquered Wei, had not recovered the old Han capital of Chang'an, and had not fundamentally altered the balance of power among the three kingdoms. Yet the campaigns were not without strategic value. They kept Wei on the defensive in the west for nearly a decade, disrupted Wei's ability to concentrate fully against Wu, and maintained the morale and martial spirit of the Shu Han state. They also demonstrated, however, that strategic ambition could not overcome material constraints. Shu Han simply did not possess the resources to project sufficient military power across the Qinling Mountains to conquer and hold territory in the Wei heartland. The political consequences of Zhuge Liang's death were profound. He had been, in practice, the sole governing authority of Shu Han since Liu Bei's death in 223. The young emperor, Liu Shan, had been entirely content to leave governance to his chancellor, and the arrangement had worked well because Zhuge Liang was both competent and loyal. But Zhuge Liang's concentration of power in his own hands meant that his death created an enormous institutional vacuum. Zhuge Liang had anticipated this problem and designated successors. Jiang Wan assumed the primary governing role after 234, followed by Fei Yi in the 240s. Both men were capable administrators who maintained internal stability and continued the alliance with Wu. But neither possessed Zhuge Liang's combination of political authority, military skill, and personal charisma, and the political dynamics of the Shu court gradually shifted in their absence.
Factions that had been suppressed or marginalized under Zhuge Liang's firm hand began to reassert themselves. The court eunuch Huang Hao, in particular, would accumulate increasing influence over Liu Shan in later years, to the detriment of good governance. Jiang Wei, a former Wei officer who had defected to Shu during the first northern expedition and been mentored by Zhuge Liang, eventually assumed military command and resumed offensive operations against Wei. Between 247 and 263, Jiang Wei launched a series of campaigns, traditionally numbered at 11, that were even less productive than Zhuge Liang's expeditions. Jiang Wei was a brave and energetic general, but he lacked the political base and institutional support that Zhuge Liang had enjoyed. His campaigns drained Shu's limited resources, created friction with civilian officials who questioned the strategic wisdom of continued offensives, and ultimately weakened rather than strengthened the state. Meanwhile, the political situation within Wei was undergoing a transformation far more consequential than anything happening in Shu. The Sima family, having gained military prominence through Sima Yi's campaigns against Zhuge Liang, was steadily accumulating political power in a process that mirrored the Cao family's own rise under the late Han dynasty. Sima Yi's political ascent within Wei had been gradual but relentless. He had served the Cao regime since Cao Cao's time and had proven himself indispensable as both administrator and general. After Zhuge Liang's death freed him from the Western Front, Sima Yi turned his attention more fully to court politics. The critical moment came in 249, when the Wei regent Cao Shuang, a member of the Cao royal family who had been ruling jointly with Sima Yi on behalf of the young emperor Cao Fang, left the capital Luoyang for a hunting excursion. Sima Yi, who had been feigning illness and political disinterest, seized control of the capital in a swift coup. He closed the city gates, occupied the arsenals, and presented Cao Shuang with an ultimatum. Cao Shuang, a man of limited resolve, surrendered. Sima Yi had him and his entire faction executed shortly afterward, despite having promised them safety, a breach of faith that was noted by contemporaries and historians alike. The Gaoping Tombs incident, as this coup came to be known, was the decisive turning point in Wei's internal politics. From 249 onward, the Sima family held effective control of the Wei state, and the Cao emperors were rulers in name only. This situation was strikingly parallel to the late Han dynasty, where the Cao family had reduced the Han emperors to figureheads before eventually replacing them. The irony was not lost on anyone, least of all the remaining Cao loyalists. Sima Yi died in 251, but power passed smoothly to his sons. Sima Shi, the elder son, governed with considerable ability, suppressing several revolts by officials loyal to the Cao family and managing the complex politics of the Wei court. When Sima Shi died in 255, his younger brother Sima Zhao inherited the family's political position. It was under Sima Zhao that the final phase of the Three Kingdoms period began. The situation in Wu during this period was considerably less stable. Sun Quan, who had been the most politically astute of the founding generation, deteriorated markedly in his later years. His reign, which lasted until his death in 252, was marred by an increasingly erratic succession policy and a devastating factional conflict known as the struggle between the two palaces. Sun Quan wavered repeatedly over which of his sons should be named crown prince, creating uncertainty that factions at court exploited ruthlessly. The conflict between supporters of different princely candidates led to purges, executions, and the destruction of talented officials whose services Wu could ill afford to lose. Lu Xun, the brilliant general who had defeated Liu Bei at Yiling, was among those driven to death by the factional politics. He died in 245, reportedly from the combined effects of political persecution and emotional anguish. Sun Quan finally settled the succession by naming his youngest son, Sun Liang, as crown prince. But the choice of a child heir guaranteed a regency and further political instability after Sun Quan's death in 252. The regent Zhuge Ke, nephew of Zhuge Liang, illustrating the cross-kingdom family connections that characterized the era, initially showed energy and ambition, launching a major but ultimately unsuccessful campaign against Wei. His failure, combined with his increasingly autocratic behavior, led to his assassination in 253 in a palace coup. Wu would suffer through several more changes of ruler and rounds of factional violence in the years that followed. Sun Liang was deposed in 258 and replaced by Sun Shu, who reigned until 264 and was succeeded by Sun Hao, whose reign would be characterized by extravagance and cruelty. The institutional foundations of the Wu state remained solid enough to sustain it for another 2 decades. But the political coherence that Sun Quan had provided in his prime was never recovered. By the mid-250s, the trajectory of the three kingdoms was becoming clear. Wei, despite, or perhaps because of, the Sima family's usurpation of power, remained by far the strongest of the three states, and was now governed by men who had both the ambition and the capacity to pursue reunification. Shu Han was weakening, its resources strained by Jiang Wei's inconclusive campaigns and its politics increasingly dysfunctional. Wu was riven by factional conflict and governed by rulers who lacked the ability of the kingdom's founder. The question was no longer whether the three kingdoms would be reunified, but when and by whom. And the answer to both questions lay with the Sima family in the formidable military machine they now controlled. The final chapter of the Three Kingdoms era unfolded with a speed and decisiveness that belied the decades of stalemate that had preceded it. Within 20 years of Sima Shi's consolidation of power, all three kingdoms would cease to exist, replaced by a single dynasty that, however briefly, restored the unity of China. The process was neither smooth nor inevitable at every step, but the broad trajectory was unmistakable. The strongest state would absorb the weakest, then turn its full attention to the survivor. The political story of this period is fundamentally the story of how the Sima family completed their transformation from subjects to sovereigns, and how the ruling houses of Shu Han and Wu proved unable to resist the tide. Sima Shi died in 255, his health broken by the strain of suppressing the rebellion of Guanchu Jian and Wen Qin in Huainan. His brother, Sima Zhao, succeeded him as the effective ruler of Wei, inheriting both the family's vast political network and its delicate relationship with the nominal emperor, Cao Mao. Sima Zhao was perhaps less naturally commanding than his brother, but he was no less ambitious and proved equally ruthless when circumstances required it. The relationship between Sima Zhao and Emperor Cao Mao deteriorated steadily through the late 200s and 50s. Cao Mao was not content to serve as a puppet. He was intelligent, literate, and possessed of a stubborn dignity that refused to accept the humiliation of his position. He watched as Sima Zhao accumulated titles and honors, as the court increasingly oriented itself around the Sima family rather than the Cao dynasty, and as his own role was reduced to that of a ceremonial figurehead who could not even appoint his own household servants without Sima approval. In 260, Cao Mao reached his breaking point. In a decision that was brave to the point of recklessness, the young emperor announced to a small group of attendants that he intended to move against Sima Zhao personally. "The intentions of Sima Zhao are known to everyone in the street," he reportedly declared, a phrase that would become one of the most famous in Chinese political discourse, a byword for ambitions so transparent that no one could pretend ignorance of them. Cao Mao's plan, such as it was, involved leading a small force of palace guards and servants directly against Sima Zhao's residence. The result was both predictable and tragic. Cao Mao's pitiful force was intercepted before it reached its objective. The emperor himself, sword in hand, charged forward with a desperation that momentarily caused Sima Zhao's soldiers to hesitate. Killing an emperor was, after all, an act of almost unthinkable transgression. But an officer named Cheng Ji, acting on what he understood to be Sima Zhao's wishes, drove his spear through the emperor's chest. Cao Mao died in the street, his blood soaking into the dust, the last Chao emperor to make any meaningful attempt to resist the Sima family's domination. The political fallout was significant, but ultimately manageable for Sima Zhao. The killing of an emperor could not go entirely unaddressed. Even a puppet emperor retained enormous symbolic authority, and the act of regicide shocked the political class. Sima Zhao sacrificed Cheng Ji, who was executed along with his family, despite having acted in Sima Zhao's interest. This was coldly pragmatic. Cheng Ji's death provided a scapegoat and allowed Sima Zhao to publicly mourn the emperor he had effectively ordered killed. A new puppet emperor, Cao Huan, was installed, the last of the Cao line to sit on the Wei throne. With the imperial house now thoroughly cowed and the court firmly under his control, Sima Zhao turned his attention to the strategic opportunity that had been developing for years: the conquest of Shu Han. The Western Kingdom had been weakening for some time. Jiang Wei's repeated northern expeditions had drained Shu's limited resources without achieving any lasting gains. The internal politics of the kingdom had become increasingly toxic, with the eunuch Huang Hao exercising a malign influence over the ruler Liu Shan and working to undermine Jiang Wei's position. Liu Shan himself, now decades into his reign, had never developed into an effective ruler. He was passive, easily influenced, and seemingly content to let others manage the affairs of state while he pursued his own pleasures. The man Sima Zhao chose to lead the invasion of Shu was Deng Ai, a brilliant and unconventional general who had spent years studying the geography of the Western approaches. The campaign, launched in 263, was a masterpiece of strategic planning, combined with audacious improvisation. A large Wei force under Zhang Hui advanced along the main routes into Shu, engaging Jiang Wei's army and pinning it in place. Meanwhile, Deng Ai led a smaller force on an extraordinary march through what was considered impassable mountain terrain, wrapping themselves in blankets and rolling down cliffs, cutting paths through virgin forest, crossing territory that no army had ever traversed. Deng Ai's force emerged behind Shu's defensive lines, descending into the Chengdu plain with a speed that caught the Shu court completely off guard. A hastily assembled Shu army was defeated at Mianzhu, where Zhuge Zhan, the son of Zhuge Liang, died fighting. With the road to the capital now open and no significant forces remaining to oppose the Wei advance, Liu Shan made the decision to surrender. Jiang Wei, still holding his defensive positions against Zhang Hui's army, received the imperial order to lay down his arms. The kingdom that Liu Bei had founded and Zhuge Liang had sustained was extinguished. The aftermath of the conquest was marked by a bitter power struggle among the victors. Zhang Hui, ambitious and jealous of Deng Ai's glory, accused his rival of harboring treasonous intentions. Deng Ai was arrested and placed in a prison cart for transport back to the capital. Zhang Hui then attempted to launch his own rebellion, hoping to use the conquered territory of Shu as a base for an independent power. Jiang Wei, who had secretly encouraged Zhang Hui's ambitions in a last desperate gambit to restore Shu, participated in the plot. But the rebellion collapsed almost immediately when Zhang Hui's own officers refused to follow him. Both Zhang Hui and Jiang Wei were killed in the resulting chaos. Deng Ai, still in his prison cart, was murdered by soldiers sent by Zhang Hui's faction before word of the rebellion's failure could save him. The conqueror of Shu thus received no reward for his achievement, only death at the hands of his own side. With Shu absorbed, only Wu remained,
But before the Sima family could address the last of the three kingdoms, there was one final piece of domestic political business to complete: the formal replacement of the Zhao dynasty with a Sima one. Sima Zhao himself did not live to take this final step. He died in 265, leaving the completion of the family project to his son, Sima Yan. Sima Yan wasted little time. In early 266,
he compelled the last Wei emperor, Chao Huan, to abdicate in his favor, following the same ritual script that Cao Pi had used when he accepted the abdication of the last Han emperor 45 years earlier. The symmetry was almost too neat. Just as the Cao family had displaced the Liu family of Han, so now the Sima family displaced the Cao family. Sima Yan took the throne as Emperor Wu of the Jin dynasty, and the state of Wei ceased to exist, replaced by a new dynasty that claimed the mandate of heaven. The conquest of Wu took longer than might have been expected. Although Wu was clearly the weaker state, it retained significant defensive advantages, most notably the Yangtze River, which had served as a barrier against northern invasion for decades. Moreover, the Jin dynasty needed time to consolidate its authority, absorb the former territory of Shu, and build the naval capacity necessary for a river crossing on the required scale. Wu, for its part, did little to exploit this reprieve. The kingdom's final decades were a catalogue of misrule. Sun Shu, who had taken the throne after the deposition of Sun Liang, died in 264 and was succeeded by Sun Hao, a grandson of Sun Quan. Sun Hao proved to be perhaps the worst ruler in the entire Three Kingdoms period, and the competition for that distinction was not insignificant. He was cruel, capricious, and given to elaborate displays of sadism that alienated even his most loyal supporters. He executed officials for trivial offenses, indulged in extravagant building projects while his people suffered, and refused to listen to the counsel of the few capable administrators who remained in his service. The veteran statesman Lu Kai submitted memorial after memorial urging reform and restraint, all of which were ignored. The general Lu Kang, son of the great Lu Xun, maintained Wu's defenses along the Yangtze with skill and dedication, but he received little support from the court and died in 274, removing the last truly capable military commander from Wu's service. With each passing year, Wu's administrative capacity eroded, its military readiness declined, and the morale of its officials and soldiers deteriorated. Sima Yan, meanwhile, was methodically preparing for the final campaign. He appointed capable governors along the frontier with Wu, ordered the construction of a massive fleet in the upper Yangtze, in the former territory of Shu, where the work could proceed beyond Wu's ability to interfere, and built up the logistical infrastructure necessary to support a large-scale invasion. The architect of the military plan was Du Yu, a gifted strategist who argued forcefully that Wu was ripe for conquest and that delay would only risk allowing a more competent ruler to emerge and stabilize the southern kingdom. The invasion was launched in early 280, and it proceeded with a speed and completeness that surprised even its planners. Jin forces advanced on multiple axes simultaneously. The fleet built in Shu sailed down the Yangtze, smashing through the chains and obstacles that Wu had stretched across the river. Land forces crossed at multiple points along the frontier. Wu's defenses, undermined by years of neglect and mismanagement, collapsed in rapid succession. City after city surrendered without significant resistance, their garrisons demoralized and their commanders unwilling to die for a ruler they despised. Sun Hao, faced with the complete disintegration of his kingdom, surrendered in the spring of 280. He was transported to the Jin capital at Luoyang, where he was treated with surprising leniency, granted a title, provided with a residence, and allowed to live out his remaining years in comfortable obscurity. The last of the three kingdoms had fallen, and China was reunified under a single dynasty for the first time since the effective collapse of Han authority decades earlier. The reunification of 280 marked the definitive end of the Three Kingdoms period, but the political legacy of the era extended far beyond its chronological boundaries. The Jin dynasty that replaced the Three Kingdoms proved tragically short-lived in its unified form. Sima Yan, so decisive in his pursuit of reunification, proved a far less effective peacetime ruler. He enfeoffed members of the Sima family with large territorial holdings and military forces, recreating precisely the conditions that had led to fragmentation in the past. After his death in 290, the Jin dynasty was torn apart by the War of the Eight Princes, a devastating civil conflict among Sima family members that made the Three Kingdoms period look almost restrained by comparison. The resulting chaos opened the door to the invasions of northern nomadic peoples and the permanent division of China into northern and southern states that would persist for nearly 3 centuries. The Three Kingdoms period thus occupies a peculiar place in Chinese historical memory. It was, in strictly political terms, a story of fragmentation, warfare, and failed state-building, an era in which the unity of the Han dynasty was shattered, and the attempts to rebuild it proved either premature or unstable. None of the Three Kingdoms produced a political system durable enough to outlast its founders, and the dynasty that ultimately reunified China collapsed into chaos within a decade of achieving that reunification. Yet the era has exerted an outsized influence on Chinese political culture and imagination. The leaders of the period, Cao Cao, Liu Bei, Sun Quan, Zhuge Liang, Sima Yi, became archetypes of political and military leadership, whose stories were told and retold, embellished and mythologized, until they became fundamental reference points in Chinese discourse about power, loyalty, strategy, and statecraft. The novel Romance of the Three Kingdoms, composed by Luo Guanzhong in the 14th century, drew on these historical materials to create one of the great works of Chinese literature, further cementing the era's place in cultural memory. The political lessons of the Three Kingdoms were absorbed by subsequent generations of Chinese statesmen and thinkers. The dangers of allowing regional military commanders to accumulate independent power, the importance of institutional stability over personal charisma, the risks of exhausting a state through aggressive military campaigns, the corrosive effects of court factionalism, and the ever-present tension between the nominal authority of the throne and the actual power of those who controlled the military. All of these themes, illustrated vividly by the events of the Three Kingdoms period, became permanent features of Chinese political thought. In the end, the Three Kingdoms period demonstrated both the remarkable resilience and the fundamental fragility of the Chinese political order. The ideal of unity, of a single state governing all of China under a single emperor holding the mandate of heaven, survived the decades of division and ultimately reasserted itself. But the mechanisms by which that unity was restored, military conquest, political manipulation, the cynical exploitation of imperial symbolism, revealed the gap between the ideal and the reality of Chinese statecraft. The mandate of heaven, that most elevated of political concepts, was in practice seized by those with the sharpest swords and the most flexible consciences. The Three Kingdoms period laid this truth bare with an unflinching clarity that neither the passage of time nor the embellishments of literature have ever fully obscured.